Welcome, Immortalites, to another round of the conversations. That's right, we're starting them back up again. And today I had a pretty fun one. It is my friend Pete Smissen from the Aussie English YouTube/podcast channel, and also Pete vs. Plants YouTube channel. He's been on, this is his fourth appearance now, so been on a couple of times, and we just like to ramble and go through different topics. So we went through AI, Australian history, world history, geography, biology. What else did we talk about? Education, growth, being doppelgangers, like it all kind of mixes and merges together. So a really fun episode. I really do hope you enjoy it. And without further ado, here is Pete.
I always wonder how much they're going to be able to have those sorts of AI in the future, right? Where you can just listen to someone's voice, take a few photos of them, have them walk around, jump, and then be able to sort of diagnose, oh, they've got this issue or they've got this issue. Because I imagine, especially with the physical stuff, like, you go to a massage therapist and he's like, oh, these muscles are all fucked up. Or you go to a chiropractor and they're like, this is screwed up. I can imagine that probably a lot of that can be diagnosed just by looking at you or by having you walk or go through a certain range of motions, right? And then they can be like, yeah, it looks like these muscles are too tight. This one's not. This is an issue here. And, you do these stretches or do this.
Yeah, I think that's the crazy ones. The when it's so good that it's not just doing it for yourself, but for other people. So you can look at someone. I remember, switching back quite a decade or two, when I was trolling all these game forums, so like pickup artists and things like that. A lot of it was utter horse crap. A lot of it was actually pretty good psychology. And then there was this stuff that was real in between. And a lot of them had all of these kind of general rules where it was like, if a woman's wearing red, it's kind of like an indication that she's actually like looking to pick up, and it has these like psychological things she might not notice that she's doing. But if you have enough data set, you can pick up, oh, like you're more likely to score with her than say this girl who's like kind of frumpy looking or maybe hasn't put in tons of effort into her appearance or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Another good one was and really relevant because it's just past New Year's Eve. This this guy was like, I make sure I go out not on every New Year's Eve, but every New Year's Day, because on the New Year's Day, that's the girls who are like so keen for like looking for a hookup that maybe they didn't get the previous night before. And he was saying like he scored every single New Year's Day night. And because those are like the dedicated ones because they probably partied the night before and then they're out again the next night. So yeah, imagine an AI version of this, not just like random dudes coming up with bullshit on the internet, but it checks. You look at a girl or something and it sees like a vital signs, her pulse and things, and it tells, oh yeah, she's ovulating right now, or she's whatever.
Yeah, it gives you a percentage chance. You're wearing Oculus or something. You're in like, what is it, like semi VR, where you can sort of have like Pokemon Go, where you would look through the camera on your phone and it would sort of overlay these images onto the real world. I wonder how long before people start wearing contact lenses or glasses or something that sort of allows them to have that sort of information pop up as they're going about their daily lives. And, so that'd be really interesting. Like, yeah, I imagine too, if you were to go somewhere like China, imagine being like a government official with those sorts of glasses and just being able to look at random people in the street and just probably get all the information you wanted on them. This guy's a criminal, that girl, she's so-and-so, this guy's a doctor, that guy's this. I doubt that the average person would probably get access to that kind of information. But that'd be insane, right? Like imagine one day you're able to wear these sorts of glasses and just look around and instantly get like a read of the room, literally, and know, what's everyone's professions, how old's everyone, their emotions, are they happy, sad, like get it told to you, more deeply than you just having to work it out based on your own intuition.
Yeah. And it's whether you can keep that kind of power to people, whether it will spread out, whether it's because that's like some of the scary stuff that people talk about when it comes to AI. It's it'll get whoever gets it first. It's going to be so much of an advantage that you actually can kind of leap forward. And
Yep.
most technologies of things like that, people would say, oh, the guns, for example, when perhaps the Spanish had them, and they were, did they have them when they were going to Latin America?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think that
they
was one
certainly,
of the big changes, yeah, because that was 1600s, wasn't it?
yeah, well, they certainly had. I remember reading this book, which was, I think it was like the last days of the Incas, something like that. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was when the Spanish went to the kind of Peruvian, Chilean, because the Inca Empire ran from basically uh, into Colombia, Ecuador, all of Peru, or like what is now modern day Peru, and I think even went to like large parts of Bolivia and Ecuador. I should probably show this on the map behind me.
Yeah,
So it
I'm
took,
looking behind you,
yeah,
trying to work
yeah.
it out on the map that's on the
It
wall.
it
He's
it
got South America
basically,
there, guys.
yeah. So just for those who are just listening, yeah, like the little Peruvian sections right on the left hand side, the western side of South America, but it basically took up the kind of entire left side of the continent, the Inca Empire. And I
Yeah.
remember in the book they were saying one of the things was uh, when who was it? It was probably like Cortez or Santiago. Everyone seemed to be called that when they all the Spanish people. And when they went there, or Fernando, when they arrived, he arrived in his boats and he had maybe like 200 guys with him.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately 100 of them died due to diseases and things like that. But they finally they after a couple of months they get to the like main stronghold of the Incan Empire, which wasn't Machu Picchu. It was I'm not even sure. Cuzco, I guess. It was like the main area where they had all the gold, where the Sun Emperor lived and things like that. And they were kind of like were treated nicely. Then they kind of took him hostage, and then when he realized like, oh shit, these guys are gonna just steal all the gold and basically destroy my empire, he got the word out, and everyone started to attack him, like their armies, and basically because they just had metal armor and swords, and the
Mm-hmm.
Incans only had kind of rocks to throw at them. They just slayed and just
Yeah.
slayed and slayed, and basically, I think it was one of those ones where I hear it in modern day. I'm like, that just seems impossible. But every one Spanish guy killed 100 or 200 Incans in a fight, and
This
it's
is
so
that
it's just like
story though, right? Of like,
100 versus 10,000 or 20,000. Yeah,
yeah, this is that story of knights on the battlefield. It must have been just fucking horrifying, right? It would be like having the Terminator just slicing through the crowd, where you have like a knight back in, I don't know, the 13th century or whatever, wearing a huge set of armor where the only opening is like a slit where he can see his eyes. And it was one of those things I remember growing up thinking, how the fuck do these guys move around? Like, it must be so slow and everything. But it's like, they're not built to be agile. They're built to not be able to be stabbed or
yeah,
sliced, right?
they're
So
just
they're
straight
literally
up
just
tanks.
there, just hacking. Yeah, they don't care about being hit effectively, right? Like, they can take all these blows, and you pretty much have to get a blade up under the helmet or under the armpit or something to be able to kill these guys. And so you have to get them to the ground and everything. The crazy thing was, these bastards of like knights were, because they were so high up, when they were at war and in these battles, a lot of the time, if they were beaten, they wouldn't be killed because they were worth so much money too. You could ransom them. So
Yeah,
quite
yeah.
often, they're wearing all this literal armor, and they have this figurative armor, right, too, or this non-literal, physical armor of being worth a lot of money, so that if they get captured, there's this huge impetus not to kill them because you can ransom them and make, hundreds of thousands, the equivalent of probably millions of dollars, by ransoming them back to their families after the battles. But you wonder how often these poor little plebs were like trying to capture the knights and then just got slaughtered.
Yeah,
because,
exactly.
because they're just like, you're gonna need more than that. You're gonna have to you're gonna have to hold these guys down. But yeah, it does seem frightening. One crazy thing about this sort of warfare with indigenous groups, I think it's the same in South America. It was definitely the case in Australia. The downfall seems to be that the colonizers, or the people coming externally, usually from Europe, they tend to arrive on the scene and then immediately focus on the relationships between the different groups. and who's fighting who's the top dog, what are the other clans doing, where are they located, who's worth partnering with, and they usually get them to kind of fight against one another. And that's the sort of the saddest part about it, is that you have this lack of foresight. Obviously, hindsight's a bitch, but a lack of understanding from, say, like the Native Americans, that these Spanish conquistadors were not there to help, but they would in the short term, right? So the Incan leader would be like, of a certain clan, would be like, I'm having trouble with these guys over the mountain. Can you guys help us fuck these guys up, and we'll give you some gold? And not realize it's kind of like partnering with the mafia when you're a small fry, right? And showing the mafia that you've got all this money, and you're like, yeah, we'll just pay the mafia to do this thing with this enemy that we have, and they go and do it, and then they come back and they're like, so we saw that you've got like a bank vault full of millions of dollars and no one's protecting it. Mind if we take a look?
Yeah. So the other thing was, not only with the diseases, some of the diseases would get the conquistadors as they came in, but usually it was they brought in smallpox, typhus, cholera, and that would just absolutely wreck the populations. And so it would just,
well, apparently a lot of them encountered the diseases way before the actual Europeans, right? And it's the same thing in Australia. I think in the US, the Native Americans had like 90% of their population wiped out before they even encountered any Europeans, because the plague is obviously going to be spreading and stuff, in front. It's going to be spreading in front of wherever the Europeans are. And that must have been horrifying, going through that period. I'm always so fascinated by those initial stages of contact between such disparate civilizations. Like it's probably the closest we would ever get as humans to contact with an alien life form that's kind of on par with us intelligence wise, that we can actually communicate with and have conversations with and learn from. It must have been such a fascinating time. Like, I would love to have known what it was like from both sides, especially in Australia, just because I'm Australian. I would love to have known what were the average Indigenous people thinking, like in terms of their understanding of the world, their cult. Like, what the fuck do you make of a huge sailing ship that just suddenly appears on the horizon and then anchors in the bay locally, and then these dudes dressed in weird clothing with weird swords with languages you've never heard just pop up on the shore and are like, how's it going? Like, I can't imagine I can't imagine what that's actually like to go through that when you're I would imagine, this is coming from a place of ignorance, but I imagine the worldview of the average Indigenous group would have been so small. Like, they would have known a handful of clans, a handful of dialects. They would have had all of their customs and their beliefs, but that would have been sort of it with, contacting other groups around the world. It would have been so localized. But when you think about like these Europeans making these huge jumps geographically, effectively, it's like, oh, fuck it, let's go to the other end of the world and just, see what's there for us to take. And they jump up on the shore and they're like, g'day, guys. I can't imagine that sort of shock. And for the Europeans, it must have been something that they would have gone through repeatedly, but pretty quickly gotten used to. Like, you'd have those people that, had never left their town in Great Britain, but then decide, screw this place. I'm getting a job as a sailor, even though 50% of them die at sea, and trying to make my money. And they end up, sailing around the world and seeing all this stuff and being mind blown. But then after doing that once, you would imagine, okay, we're pretty used to what's going on now. Whereas, these Indigenous people must have this has just never happened. They've never heard stories about this sort of thing happening, at least initially. I'm sure they did after it. The boats started coming repeatedly,
more regularly.
But it must have been amazing. Like, I mean that tragically. It was obviously horrible, but at the same time, it must have been just such an interesting period to live through on either side of that. Whether you were a European colonizing somewhere like Sydney in Australia, or you were an Indigenous person experiencing this. And obviously, it was shitter for the Indigenous side of it, but it must have been just such a I don't know. I liken it to meeting aliens for the first time. Whether or not the aliens conquer us and then just slaughter us, that initial stage, especially if it is peaceful initially, must be just like, insanity.
Yeah, so wild. And imagine being that sailor, goes from his small little town in Cornwall of, I don't know, 1,000, couple of thousand people. No one ever leaves. He goes around the
Yeah.
world, or, you know, I was reading a book on the Dutch East India Trading Company, and they'd do this tremendous trek before all the like Suez and Panama canals that go basically all the way around Africa, across the showing my lack of geography here, maybe Pacific, I don't know, all the way to like Latin America or into Asia and stuff, and then all the way back. And so they would see just, you know, continents of different things along the whole way, and then they you know, have a bit of money and they set up shop back in Cornwall. And imagine trying to explain your experiences to people who are like still basically just living day to day. You know, that'd be pretty wild.
The local pubs must have been an amazing place at that time, where you would just be able to hear people's stories. You know, you'd see these sailors and these other, you know, flagrants that would just come in or whatever and hang out and get drunk and tell you these stories. And when you've got, you know, no experience of the world, like,
you'd think it's bullshit.
Yeah, or it could be the other. It could be the other way, right? You could just believe everything.
Oh yeah, if they're really convincing. Yeah,
yeah, and it makes me think about those times too. Another example would be living in Roman times and seeing images of, say, lions and elephants for the first time and just being like, "What the fuck is this thing?" You know, imagine you live in England. You're stationed at Hadrian's Wall or whatever, and there are just mosaics there, or you know, some drawings of these elephants, right? And you've heard of them, you know they exist, but you've never seen them, and they're just this impossible looking animal. The size is just insane, and you're probably stationed with people at Hadrian's Wall who have come from all over the Roman Empire, some of whom have probably seen these animals in, say, places like Egypt or whatever, and trying to have them explain to you, oh no, they're legit. You know, it must have just been a crazy time. Even later on after the Roman period, when, you know, different parts of Europe were seeing these animals, they had them imported, right? So, like, again, I can't imagine what it would have been like in Great Britain when zoos first started becoming a thing. And they started having these animals that they would just get from all over the world. And it would be the way that you, as the average person, would be able to effectively travel without traveling, right? You get to see all these things without actually going overseas. The most fucked up thing, though, about those zoos at that time, right, the sort of Victorian era zoos, was that they often had Indigenous people.
Yeah, they'd have people, yeah.
And you're just like, it's so effed up to think that actually happened, right? Like, they had human beings as part of the zoo.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild, man.
Yeah,
wild times.
Another cool one. What about the do you know much about the Indigenous dudes in Australia who used to hang out with who was it again? Governor Phillip. So the guy who colonized Australia was leading the boats. He took back 2 Indigenous dudes from Australia to Great Britain. And that's another one of those things where, imagine that at that time.
And one of them was like wearing a suit and things like that, right? Like they
were both very well dressed and everything. Yeah. And they've got to meet I think it would have been the Queen at the time. It may have been the King. I'm not sure. It may have been the King at the time. It may have been Edwardian, right? King Edward. I'm not sure. I've forgotten. But they brought them back, and they got to. It'd be like, again, it's that sort of thing of, if the aliens decided to take you back to their home world and be like, hey, check this shit out.
yeah. And
meet our leader.
And the leader is just, you know, what would maybe not be the peak apex back in your civilization, or, you know, I know there's a lot of respect for elders and stuff, but, you know, if it was like a 20-year-old queen who'd just taken over England or something, and you're like, she's it. Like, she's what? The main. She's the top dog. Like, I could arm wrestle her and beat her ass.
I know. I loved reading about Australian history and that sort of stuff. And one of the most amazing things was those Indigenous people used to always just take everything in their stride, right? They showed such strength and sort of fortitude when faced with these kind of adversities. So yeah, imagine that it would be like the people from the English town leaving that for the first time ever on steroids. If you were, say, you know, an Indigenous man or woman that's lived off the land for your entire life, you've only probably ever encountered hundreds of people, let alone thousands of people, and only a single race. It must have been just absolutely mind blowing to jump on a boat for 6 months or whatever, and then go to a foreign country like England with all these buildings, all of this noise, probably all these smells. It would have been amazing to know what they actually thought if they had been able to write a diary, like a daily diary of their experiences. Like, went to Great Britain, place smells like shit. There are these
Yeah,
huge
exactly.
rock structures everywhere. There are, what did they think of the average woman and the average man and the children? What they were doing. Did they experience things like drunken people? I mean, I'm sure they would have back home in Australia, but yeah, those sorts of things I really wish. That's the saddest part, I think, a lot of the time about like colonization. You don't generally have a lot of Indigenous people who are very literate at the time, obviously in say English, and able to, or whatever other language, and able to keep track and write down things. And so you often miss out on those stories, and only have the sort of white side of it.
Yeah. The stories are the sad part where you miss out, and because their story structure would be more Dreamtime things, so it's not like it's super detailed, accurate to the point of how many people came and things like that. Even though a lot of that is relatively boring, like I've read a fair few history books, and some of them kind of go into the there was this much wheat crop in this year, and this was 20% downturn compared to that.
Yep.
And it's boring as hell if you read the actual physical stuff that's been written down as in libraries and things like that. But when you construct the story of, the wheat crop was ravaged by mice due to this technological innovation or things like that, then you go like, okay, yeah, it's becoming more interesting.
Have you read Watkin Tench? He's sort of like that. He does do some of the whole, there were 20 bushels of wheat this year from this one farm. But he was, I think, an officer or someone in the, would it be the Marines that were brought over when they first colonized Australia? And he kept a diary. And so you get to hear effectively firsthand through his eyes about a lot of the things that went on, like the spearing of Governor Phillip by, I don't think it was Bennelong, but it was one of the other Indigenous guys there that ended up shoving a spear through his shoulder, right? And
Dang.
As a warning, it was sort of retribution, because Phillip at the time had been kidnapping local Indigenous people, including Bennelong, in order to try and force them to learn English so that they could be used as intermediaries, right? They could go between the two sides, and he could develop relationships, because he saw it was very, very vital for the survival of the colony for there to be good relationships with the locals, and that he was a really forward-thinking person in that he did respect, to some degree, he kidnapped, but he did respect the Indigenous people, didn't want war, didn't want violence. He wanted to be on good terms with them. But yeah, he was kidnapping a bunch of them to be able to teach them English and then use them. But he ended up, I think Bennelong escaped, right, and ran off. And he ends up going to meet him. He hears about where he is, goes to meet him, and one of the other Indigenous guys there spears him through the shoulder when he walks forward. Yeah, and it's crazy though, because the story is Arthur says, no one respond, don't pull your guns out, leave it, let's go. And the spear that was used was a retribution type weapon. It wasn't designed to kill. It was designed for punishment, where I think it was like a very smooth tip, right? So you can push it in and pull it out easily, whereas they had death spears effectively, which would be covered in shards of rocks and sharp things, and they might even put their feces on it and everything. So it was effectively, if you get stabbed with this thing, you're fucked.
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
no chance to survive, and he wouldn't aim for your shoulder. But yeah, that was an interesting.
Did he die from it?
No, he survived that. So
yeah, okay.
That was our first Governor Phillip.
Got some
into the spearing, but Watkin Tench talks about that story, because I'm pretty sure he went with him, because he was one of the high up officers at the time, and so he would always go to these sort of. He would have the information about the interesting stuff that was going on in the colony at the time, and it would have been like a large high school, right? You would have had 1,000 people. Everyone would have pretty much known everyone, and so the stories would have gone around the gossip and everything like that, and he also went to these sorts of things. Like if Governor Phillip was like, oh, we're going to deal with this thing, you'd be like, get in there, Watkin, let's do it. And so he would be able to write down the story. And I think he's the best detailed journalist from that initial period of colonization.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I got to say, my Australian history is it's probably like my world history. I know bits and pieces from all around the world, so I know like, and some of it is it's kind of like distorted because I know I've read a couple of books like Voss or Richard Flanagan's like Book of Fish, where it's based upon it. Well, it's based upon a person or a real life place and event, but it's a person writing what he would have experienced or things like that. So it's like through the kind of intermediary, you get the details. Like, oh, okay, I know a little bit about the Tasmanian
based on the true story,
penitentiary and stuff like that. But then there's also talking fish and yeah.
Have you read or listened to David Hunt's True Gert? And there's a third one.
No, I haven't.
They're really good.
Yeah, I think I've heard of that, but yeah, haven't read it. Yeah.
So I think he was a lawyer. I interviewed him on my podcast, so yeah, go and have a listen to that. But he was a lawyer who ended up getting into writing, I think, and wrote some stuff about Australian history, and it got picked up, and they asked him to write some books on this stuff. And he effectively goes through European Australian history from colonization all the way through to the modern era, and is just funny as fuck. He makes so many funny references and jokes, and it sort of makes Australian history and history in general palatable. So it is quick-paced, fast-moving, and just quite often hilarious, where he's poking fun at both sides, of the story usually. And I definitely recommend the audiobook because he has all these side notes that he reads, but he has these little sound effects to show you that he's about to read the side note or whatever, the stuff at the bottom of the page. And so you'll hear this like a sheep going meh, and then he reads the note quickly. Little did he know Philip was blah 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 blah. And then in the second book, I think it's like it may be a sheep in the second book, and in the first one it's like a convict's cat of nine tails just going whoosh.
Yeah.
So it's just a really, really funny listen or read, but I definitely recommend if you want kind of a fast-paced, humorous, it's almost like Bill Bryson-esque kind of humor, then definitely read that if you're interested in Australian history, because it's 3 books and it's pretty much, a short course in Australian history and how everything was. He links everything together really well. This was happening at the time because of this, and it led to this thing that then happened, and that happened after that, and this person did this, and so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, what would you rate it in terms of embellishments to historical fact?
I think I'd have to know more about history to be able to do that objectively.
Yeah, okay.
But I think he does a pretty good job. There's no
talking fish in it, so
no. It's meant to be. It's not meant to be fiction. It's meant to be non-fiction.
Yeah,
but
okay,
he's also got a sort of comedic kind of take on it too, where there'll be all these things like he'll be talking about, what's a good example? What's the name of Burke and Wills, right? The guys who went on one of the longest expeditions from Melbourne all the way up to, I think they were meant to be going to the Capricorn, the bay there at the top of Australia, or that huge, what's it called again? I've forgotten, but the thing between Arnhem Land and northern Queensland. And they ended up having like that tragic expedition where Burke pretty much just did everything wrong, right? Like he took horses instead of camels to get across deserts, and he would get rid of food when he should have been getting rid of, non-perishable goods that weren't, crucial to survival. So there were, he just takes the piss out of him pretty much the whole time, just like these dumb fucking decisions. And that was one of those saddest parts of Australian history where you read the book. I think there's a good one by, is it Peter Fitzgibbons or Fitzsimons? Sorry, Fitzsimons or Fitzsimmons. And he details it. It's quite a tome. It's quite a beast of a book. But yeah, Burke was just so sniffing his own farts the entire time and just wouldn't listen to anyone else. And you just like, this guy is just taking all these people to their death. spoiler alert, everyone
Yeah,
dies.
yeah. That's
But
the Australian adventurous treks inland and big treks.
yeah.
All of them seem to die. There's no real,
Uh,
you know, where we actually did it. Like
well, the only
amazing
ones that ever
moments.
seem to survive are the ones that somehow seem to be rescued by the indigenous people. So it's usually dumb luck.
Yeah,
I think in the case of Burke and Wills, there was one guy that survived, and he was the last dude with Wills. I think Wills and he survived up until the end, and then Wills died. I think they all end up dying from scurvy because they don't know how to. The tragic thing in the case of Burke and Wills was that the indigenous people knew what they needed to eat to be able to get vitamin C, right? And it was a local bean or berry, and the European guys were watching them, but they didn't know how to cook it. And it was the cooking process that was the most important part to be able to release the nutrients that they needed to be able to stay healthy. So these fucking dumb Europeans were. I think they had one guy who kept being violent towards the indigenous people, so they just bailed and were like, "You're on your own, bitch."
yeah,
and he ends up dying. But the guy at the very end, the one that survives, is the one who gets rescued by the indigenous people. So he ends up pairing up with them and being like, I think he just follows them around and just won't leave them alone. And they keep sort of giving him food and taking care of him. And then they realize they're like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's fucked. We're going to have to keep him with us. And so they hold on to it, or, they feed him and give him fish. And I've forgotten this berry or nut, but they make him these little cakes from it that have, I think, vitamin C in it so that he didn't get scurvy. And he ends up sort of starving but surviving until the Europeans make it. But yeah, there's Tim Flannery, The Explorers, is a pretty good book for sort of, again, a rough view of the different explorers in Australia. And I think he usually, in that book, he has like a chapter out of each of their books, because I think it's pretty much all these explorers have got diaries or books or something that they've published. And Tim Flannery's taken out sort of a pivotal moment of each of these expeditions across time from when Australia was colonized all the way up until the present time when the book was published. So he has a good spread of it. But yeah, usually the guys that did the best and survived were the ones who knew how to have good relations with the local indigenous people and, got past the whole racist idea of them being idiots and realized that they actually were in tune with the land and had survived there for thousands of years and knew what was going on and how to eat what and everything like that. The local indigenous people would always effectively teach them, oh, here's how you make food, you morons. Like, it's fucking everywhere. There's food all over the place. You just need to know where to look, you dickheads. And then they would just, then the Europeans would be like, and then survive. But the ones who would just be like, we can do this without them, they pretty much always die.
yeah. A little bit of humility. And then it's also, though, you have to balance that with, they would do just some straight up crazy shit. I remember meeting this guy here who had a farm in Chile, and he would always get so pissed off at the Chilean farmers because they would kill their cows in a certain way, which would basically take ages, make the cow suffer tons, and I think it actually had some economic impact in terms of like ruined the skin or the hide, or like and they'd do it in this way because that was kind of their culture and ritual. Whereas there was modern technology to do it in a way which was more humane, I guess. And he would just be like, I can't, I've tried to convince them so many times. I've shown them, used whatever logic I could try to break them out of this culture and ritual that they're in, but he just couldn't do it. So he just had to accept even though it's super inefficient and in terms of like money making, kind of morally, ethically, like there's nothing I can do. I can't convince these people. And so you'd have to balance it with watching Aborigines perhaps do some crazy ass dances or like self-flagellation, or I'm just making examples here. I don't know if they do any of those. But yeah, then it would be like, oh, okay, what mix?
Well, again, from an outsider's perspective, I think one of the biggest things was ownership and possessions that was difficult to deal with the indigenous people, because they didn't have any sense as, hunter-gatherers that moved around and didn't have like a house full of shit and a supermarket and a mall and everything to go and buy stuff from. They didn't give a crap about anything they couldn't carry effectively, right? So a lot of the time, I think Europeans cottoned onto it pretty quickly and worked out what they actually needed. And you'll go, I think this was one of those things, you'll see it at the Museum Victoria. They've got these huge stone pillars out the front of the cafe that have like, I think it's like looking glass, blanket, scissors, tomahawk written on these things. And these were the things that were traded to Indigenous people. I think it was what was traded for Melbourne. It may have been what I've forgotten his name, the guy who had syphilis that came up, and it ended up effectively tricking the local Indigenous people into getting Melbourne, 600,000 hectares or something, and he traded them like a bunch of axes and tomahawks and they're the same thing, but you know what I mean. They're trading these things, and they were just like, yeah, no worries. And the guys doing the trade were like, we don't actually own the land. It's like, yeah, you keep your piece of paper that apparently says that you own this place now, and we'll just take all the shit that you just brought and gave us. Thanks. So, but I think it's interesting to see how much that's kind of still an issue today, that idea of ownership and possessions and everything. Like, a big thing that I've heard about from friends and family who've visited and traveled to and worked in Indigenous communities in particular, so like places like Catherine and Alice Springs, is that the government quite often thinks, I'll just throw money at the problem by giving them stuff, give them houses, give them cars, but they don't use it like non-Indigenous Australians would use those things. They'll drive the car until the petrol runs out, and then they just walk away, right? So they don't think, they don't care. Like, at least those very, very, very traditional ones. And the same with houses. They'll have, 20 people live in the house, and they just trash the joint or use it as literally a shelter, and they don't care about, its upkeep or its value. What can I sell this for in the future? Do I need to pass on generational wealth to my kids? They don't see it as that kind of, object like it. Yeah. And so but it's interesting that that's kind of a, cultural practice that has maintained itself the entire time, and that we still have this issue with donating money or donating things to Indigenous people in Australia, and not really being in tune with what they actually need, how they're going to use it. And that's the issue with the government, I think, in general, right? They just think throw money at something until it goes away, and don't realize, the same thing with like the Indigenous youth in jail. They're not inherently more violent or more criminal, but the way in which society is set up and the way in which society treats them leads to more of them ending up in jail and having these bad outcomes. So yeah, I'm always amazed at how the government in Australia, probably everywhere, this is probably just a European government kind of thing, doesn't listen to local voices and try and actually help. It thinks I know what's best for XYZ and always just throws money at it and just hopes that it goes away. Because,
I don't think that's a European government thing. I think that's a government thing.
The government thing. Yeah, exactly. I need the votes for the next election. So look, we donated $1 billion that got wasted to this, issue, but it totally got wasted.
Yeah. I was describing effective altruism to my dad and brother last night. Have you heard of it?
Vaguely.
So basically,
I assume that it is where you're nice to others and it actually works.
Yeah, that's the point of it. And yeah, it's sort of like when you actually take a look at charities, most of them are super inefficient. Maybe 8%, 10% actually goes to where it's meant to go to, and the rest, the 90%, goes through administration costs at best.
Yeah.
At best,
wages.
Yeah.
Or the church, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit of a minefield if you start looking deeper into those sorts of things.
It's pretty fucked up to think, I donated $100. $8 of that went to actually help these people. And you're sort of like, and then they'll be like, can you give some more? And you're like, why would I do that? I'm better off just handing out money to people individually when I go to different places where, people in need exist. It's better for me to just go to India and just drop money in the street than to give it to, say, World Vision and have them do it on my behalf. I love that. Is it Steve Hughes, that comedian? He's like, I never give it to charities. Fuck that. It's like, who I give it to? I give it to homeless people on the side of the road because at least they're honest. What are you going to spend this on? Drugs. He's like, what was I going to spend it on? I was going to spend it on drugs. So at least he's honest. And he's like, all these charities, they're like, give us the money. Why? We'll give it to people who need it for you. And it's
yeah.
Will you? Yeah, totally. We'll do that for you. We'll do that on your behalf, you know?
Yeah, funnily enough, one of the most effective ones is where they give it to people on the ground because they know what they actually need. So it's like I think it's an African charity, and so of course some skimming off the top still happens. So it's maybe 92% of it makes it to there, which is pretty fantastic, to be honest.
It's still 10 times, you're 8%, right? Or more.
Yeah. And that's one of the most effective ones because people know, I'd actually need shingles to patch the hole in my roof, or I need to buy cement instead of food for this upcoming month.
This seems to be the story of the world, right? And modern civilization and just waste. Where, I mean, you'll be right up here, but that it does seem like the world is going to have to get its shit in gear with how it's using resources in all these different realms, whether it's, transport or energy or helping people that are in need all around the globe. It's like there's going to come a point, you would imagine, probably sooner rather than later, where we can't be this wasteful anymore. You can't throw $1 trillion at a problem and only say 100 billion of it gets used to actually solve that problem, and the rest of it just disappears. Because you almost see, like, Russia would be a good example of this, right? Where their military apparatus just sucked ass when it invaded Ukraine because everyone had been taking their cut all the way down from Putin through his cronies and his oligarchs, through the generals, through the officers. One way or another, all of them had sort of been out there doing their, everyone for themselves and taking their little cut. And as a result, when the money from the top trickled down at the bottom, it was a tiny, tiny, tiny amount, and quite often left everything useless, right? Like when they took out all of those trucks that had just been sitting there, they'd been like stripped of parts. And then the people who were meant to be maintaining them hadn't been, because they were sort of like, fuck it. I'd rather be smoking cigarettes than actually taking care of these trucks and rotating the wheels on them and everything. And so when they actually took them out, they drove down the road and their tires exploded and they couldn't go anywhere. And so it's that seemed to me like a massive example of just that top-down approach for throwing money at something and doing it very inefficiently. Obviously, corruption's involved there, but I think the government anywhere, tends to have that kind of approach.
I think the Americans are even worse because theirs is 10 times the Russians and the Chinese and like everyone combined. The amount they spend on military is insane. But yeah, I kind of view my thoughts on this are like it's really conflicted because like my general understanding is the more energy, resources, things that people are using, the better health outcomes, quality of life, opportunities. It's kind of, the most energy rich places using the most energy are also the ones which have the better kind of life outcomes in many ways. Yep. So, look at Australia, America, the, Western countries versus, I don't know, Myanmar or something like that. They're barely using any energy. And so it's this weird conflict where you need more energy and therefore byproducts and waste and things like that. But for me, I kind of view my position in the world as to be like just the one saying like we've grown enough. Let's like stop the growth for a little bit and and scale back some things. Even though on the general trend, it's better to be kind of going upwards and creating shit.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know if I'd be more concerned with growth or efficiency, because I think you could probably deal with one of those to be able to help deal with the other one, right? Like
you can do. There's a book called More from Less by Andrew McAfee, and it really talks about this, where you can actually have growth by becoming more efficient, using less resources. Exactly. So you're still growing, but it's because you're just putting less inputs in. That's what I imagine.
Like the population explosion in the world is probably not going to be as big an issue if you're 10 times more efficient with the food and the energy that you're using, right? That ultimately what the real problem isn't the number of souls in the world, it's the amount of resources that are required to keep those number of souls alive. And so if you need to use 10 times as much energy and food and have arable land everywhere converted to be able to grow cows or whatever, that's the problem more so than the amount of people, because you could probably take every single person in the world and shove them into a very, very small area of the planet itself, right? Like if you were to really work out how much of the space in the world actually is needed to house and keep all these people alive, it's probably still negligible. But the real problem is the footprint that keeping those people alive has, right? So how much land is destroyed and how much that then affects the global ecosystem and everything like that, and then makes life not worth living effectively if you have runaway climate change and the world heats up and we end up with everything that we're sort of currently facing. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see where it goes, because I'm also of that idea that you need a lot of people alive to be able to solve these complex problems. Like you're not going to be able to build an iPhone with 10 people in a village, right? You need a huge society with probably millions of people.
I'd say billions to get that.
Doing
to get
all
an
sorts
iPhone,
of jobs to get to a point where you could build an iPhone, right? So I think like with the solution for climate change, I don't think that's going to come from, say, curtailing the number of souls in the world. That may be a slow fix to the problem, but in the short term, again, I haven't looked into it that deeply, but my intuition says that we need
nuclear.
a huge pool of people
That's what we need.
from which we can get another Einstein, or I hate to say Elon Musk because he's a bit of a douchebag these days, but that kind of a go-getter person that is actually going to be able to make the change, quickly, and has the brains or the what would you say, the will to be able to get it to happen. But yeah,
who knows? I'm not the biggest fan of the great man sort of thing. I think it's more I put more weight on the small incremental changes done by nobodies. Another book I read recently, How Innovation Works, by Matt Ridley, kind of talks about that. It's like all these breakthroughs that you might attribute to someone, the Wright brothers with flight and things like that. There's an element, yes, but
they're the face of it, but there's also all this stuff below the surface.
Is just the amount of breakthroughs that occur simultaneously across the world, not even just in that one area, but it ends up, the only argument is that the great person makes it kind of 10 years earlier, perhaps, because they've just got that will, that drive to push it forward kind of beyond all reason and logic. And
that's that Elon Musk type person at the moment, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a place for them.
Pushing it in pretty weird directions currently.
I don't follow him too much, but
the takeover of Twitter is what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Sort of like, was that really? Was that really worth it? Jesus.
No, it'll get us to Mars, man. I swear.
Yeah, I know, but I guess it still makes sense. Your point still makes sense, though, in terms of you needing a large population from which to pull all of these individuals to be able to do the innovation, right? And you need a large population who can sustain those kinds of individuals and have those people doing those sorts of jobs, and effectively just as many minds as possible thinking about this problem. And I think the larger the population is, the more that can obviously happen. If you start reducing numbers, then you obviously have fewer people who can be able to handle those sorts of things proportionately.
Yeah. The amount of just niche jobs out there for the most, what to me seems like the most boring technological SaaS, like software as a service to businesses. And I just go like, wow, how is this work? This is insane. I wanted to ask you about your Englishman, actually. So I unfortunately, man, I struggle with your podcast sometimes because I I don't know where to go sometimes. So like I usually like to watch it on YouTube, but you haven't been making as many YouTube videos as
No.
of late, right? And then I had this old version. There was two versions of Aussie English, and I had like this old one. So I thought, oh shit, like Pete hasn't made a podcast in 6 months, but I just
I
found the
know
other
we
one
moved the
was
podcast across, and my team forgot to update the
like the
application.
redirect link. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
Where did you
And
move to out of interest?
we went to Buzzsprout because we were hoping to put ads on the
Buzzsprout's good.
podcast, and we
Yeah.
have, but it's just very, very, very few and far between in terms of the ads that are available. So it's made a few $1,000s over the last 6 months, but it really hasn't been that worth it, to be honest.
Gotcha. Yeah. You moved to a good place, but Buzzsprout's kind of at the one of the leading edges of kind of where podcasting's going, I guess. Some of the cool stuff. So you've moved to a good one in any case. I wanted to ask you though, do you think your English has changed since you started the Aussie English podcast? As in, do you think you speak more Aussie now because you're kind of forced to?
It's hard to know, right? Like, sorry, just getting a call. Hold on a second. It's hard to know because I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't had Aussie English. But I think overall, I kind of sound the same. I mean, and again, I'm saying this subjectively. I haven't. It'd be interesting to go back if I tried to
your very
objectively
first
kind of
or something.
Yeah, exactly, and try and work out how did I sound. I think part of what it's done isn't necessarily change my normal English when I'm interacting with other Australians or other people. But when I'm interacting with students and when I am creating content, I do notice that I change the way that I speak. Not necessarily in pronunciation, but I may slow things down. I also repeat things. I use a shitload of synonyms. And I kind of
me too. I do that a lot.
Intentionally did that to be able to help learners, language learners, learn vocab effectively. So if I said, today's really hot, it's a scorcher, it is sweltering, I'm boiling. When you repeat these kinds of things, I found that really useful when I was learning French and Portuguese, to be able to kind of make these webs of connection between different words and how they were associated or how they could be used. So I definitely noticed myself doing that a lot more. I don't know how much that translates into real life, like how often I actually, when having a conversation with you, for example, might try and repeat 3 synonyms for the same thing. But I've definitely noticed myself doing that when creating content for Aussie English, a lot of which is obviously on the podcast. And so you'll probably hear me more in English mode than I am currently now, right? So
yeah, I've noticed you say more slang or kind of words which are very Aussie, bugger, say g'day, mate, things like that. I noticed that
I definitely
personally.
try and turn it up a bit to at least give people that flavor.
Yeah.
And differentiate myself, but also they're going to come across that kind of language quite a bit. So if you kind of overdo it a little bit, they'll be really used to it. And the other part too is that if they end up using it, they end up kind of fitting in a little more. Like if I hear someone come up to me, even if they've got an accent and they say, "G'day, mate," and then, "Oh, bugger, I hurt my leg," I'll feel a lot sort of closer to them socio-culturally, whatever, compared to, say, if it was an American saying, "Hello, sir, I've hurt my leg." You would be like, "Oh, okay." This guy's from the US.
My old Colombian boss used to every now and then throw in a fair dinkum, but the way he'd say it would be like, geez, I'm trying to think how the Colombian way of saying the Colombian dialect, it'd be like fair dinkum, or like it's just you don't use those set of vowels and enunciation in Spanish, and so it just sounded hilarious. But everyone loved it. It was like a crowd favorite when he would do
100%. And that's that thing I'm always telling my students. And it's weird. I've had Colombians who will just refuse to use slang, and I remember saying, "Why is that?" And they're like, "It makes you look poor, makes you look like lower class, riffraff,
exactly,
violent, just." And I'm like, "What?" And it is so funny. That's when you learn so much more about other cultures, and you're like, "Oh my god, okay." So in Colombian culture, obviously, there's this socioeconomic kind of split between different classes and the language that they use, and so the lower class will, or the average person might use slang, whereas someone from the upper class will avoid it at all costs because they don't want to give away those kinds of signals to the average person. Whereas Australian culture is interesting because it's kind of it flips that on its head, where usually we have that tall poppy syndrome issue of rich, upper class people wanting to seem normal, wanting to seem like your average Joe. And so you'll have politicians always saying, "G'day, mate," and throwing in slang all the time. Barnaby Joyce is one of those guys too. Although he has grown up, I think, regionally, and he represents regional Australia, the amount of shit that he says that you just sort of like, I can't imagine a politician saying, "Oh, mate, it was going off like a frog in his sock."
Yeah, exactly.
Back in the 50s or earlier, right? Or like, we're not here to fuck spiders. So, but today in Australian culture, you do that because we hate wankers, right? The average Australian hates people who think they're better than others, or, ultimately that. And so if you don't use slang, if you don't talk a little bit like the average punter, the average Australian, you seem like you're trying to show that you are better than other people. So that was one of those things I remember battling with her. She was one of my students a few years ago, and I was just like, you need to just, well, you don't need to. You don't have to do anything, I tell you, but I would suggest implementing some of these slang words that aren't rude, that are just standard, saying things like g'day or, arvo. So innocuous stuff. Avo. I'm going to eat an avo later. Where are my sunnies? Those sorts of innocuous words that don't mean anything. It's different if you start calling someone I don't know.
Yeah, slang doesn't necessarily mean swearing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think she associated it with that because of Colombian culture. Again, you would know this better than me, but it was really interesting trying to get her to break through that.
Yeah, another one they have is the importance of education. So even if you became super wealthy via entrepreneurship, if you'd left school, if you didn't have a kind of secondary education, no amount of kind of wealth could make up for that, or social prestige. You'd kind of need it. This was my impression that I got from like a couple of different sources there. Yeah. So if you didn't have a secondary, like at least a bachelor's of something, you'd kind of be thrown in with the riffraff type, even if you were, socially wealthy or had a farm or,
It's so funny how those things seem so superficial though. Like it seems to be that kind of thing. Like in Australia, we'll have immigrants from different countries that behave different ways when it comes to, say, education. They value it differently. So the stereotype is you'll have, say, I don't know, your Indian migrant family and your Japanese migrant family or Chinese migrant, people from East Asia and Asia will come to Australia, and typically they raise their kids to be very conscious of education. So they'll be pushing hard. Like usually, at least when I was at school, it was almost always Asian families that dominated the ducks list, or that dominated any, the music, or like all of the intellectual kind of side of schooling. They were always at the top and just crushing it. And so it was really funny that just how much they would emphasize that, but then say totally ignore sport and not give a shit about running, about health, about there was no prestige at all related to doing sport comparatively, right? Compared to, say, your average Australian guy, where on the other hand, it would be like, oh, you fucking nerd. I prefer to just play footy, or do cricket or whatever in my spare time. Every minute that I have away from school, I have a football in my hand, and this is all I'm working on. And they'll almost, the average Australian guy would probably respect a lot more, say, their favorite football star than a doctor, someone who just has a doctor's degree. And the football star may have dropped out of high school to go and play football. They don't give a shit about education the same way, right? And it's the same thing with like our tradies are a good example. Everyone wants to, at least growing up, a lot of kids, more and more and more, want to be tradies, and they make a good living. They have a certain amount of prestige now in society, where you're like, well, shit, okay, tradie, dude must be pretty well off. Yeah. Whereas if I talk to my wife and I'll be like, what would you think if I was, back in Brazil and a concreter or a carpenter? And she'd be like, everyone would think you were poor as hell and dangerous. And like, they would be like, you are not marrying my daughter.
Yeah. Exactly,
and I'm like, right? What? How do you have the same job, two different people in two different countries, and one of them has a completely different income, social prestige, everything like that. And then the other country, it's kind of like, no, we don't give a shit about that. We don't want people to do that job. Like, screw that. It's so peculiar, right?
It's wild. It's wild. Yeah. Man, I'm just glad I didn't go to a school with lots of Asians. Otherwise, wouldn't have got the ducks. I would have been screwed.
I had a friend. We had a family friend who actually gave up a PhD because there were too many Chinese people in the cohort, and it wasn't a race thing. The immediate reaction is, "Oh God, dude didn't like Chinese people." The issue was, and this is another thing that universities now have to probably grapple with, because he was surrounded by so many other people from a single demographic, so they were all pretty much Chinese migrants. They were speaking Mandarin Chinese all the time, and they had their clique. And he was just he was the one non-Chinese person, not just Australian, waspy dude, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dude, but he was the only non-Chinese person. And so he was so lonely. Apparently he gave it up within a year and was just like, fuck this, I'm out, because it was in IT. And every person there was Chinese. They didn't have to speak English whilst they were, working together, interacting with one another. And they didn't care to, really, because again, another layer of it was that they come to get their degrees usually and then go home and use that degree there to be able to climb social sort of ranks, right? Or because, as you say, it's valued that they have the degree, whether or not they actually use it, because they're from a rich family already, and the dad's got heaps of factories and is already richer than your wildest dreams, and the kid's just going to work in the family business, so it didn't really matter in the first place. But that was an interesting thing, and I noticed that with Melbourne Uni in particular, because they had moved so hard towards getting money from full fee paying students. A lot of the students ended up international students. And as a result of that, a lot of the students ended up Chinese students. And whether they were Chinese or not isn't the problem. But all of a sudden, you have this huge demographic now that all comes from a single location that speaks a different language. And it was like there were these sort of two groups at the university. There were the English natives or English speakers and the Chinese speakers. And so they would suddenly, you sort of get to a certain threshold, I think, with the number of people from a certain demographic, and they just create their own kind of like group area. They know if you're the first Chinese person that comes to, say, Melbourne University, you're going to be forced to use English all the time. You're going to be making non-Chinese friends. You're going to be mixing in. But once there's 10, 20, 100, 1,000, it's just too easy now to be like, screw it. We'll just hang out with other Chinese people. I don't have to worry about learning English that well or making Australian friends, because I can have all of those needs kind of fulfilled with the Chinese demographic. And so, yeah, it definitely changed the feel of Melbourne University from when I went there for 11 years, and I starting in 2006 and finished in 2017. And I definitely did notice that change of just the feel. You would walk around and there would be, more often than not, you wouldn't hear English being spoken, and you would sort of almost feel like an outsider in a lot of the classes that you would go to just as a result of that. So again, it doesn't really bother me anymore, but I'm wondering if universities are going to have to sort of be conscious of those sorts of issues going forward and working on, I guess it would be like social cohesion, and not having a kind of ghettoization. If you have these large Indian, large Chinese demographics that come to your university and they're all doing similar courses to one another, so they all end up kind of creating a solid clique and making it undesirable for non-people in that group to do those courses because they're just going to feel lonely. I wonder if that's going to become a big issue in the future with the university's model, especially in Australia, where so much of it is like, just give me that foreign dollar.
Yeah, I was starting to see a little bit of that. Maybe that was just because as I got further in my degree, the class sizes shrank. So you start to really notice individual pockets forming. Whereas when it's an engineering class of, a cohort of 2,000 or 3,000, whatever it was, you might not notice that as much. The other one would be, I'm not sure how relevant this still is, but I believe the universities are just getting more and more women as well, and men are dropping out. So that would be another probably aspect which would very much change it. Like instead of a 50 balance, if it's getting to like 60-40, 70-30 or something, that would alter the I suppose the dynamics quite a lot as well.
That's one of those weird topics that I don't know how much you want to sort of go off on it, but it's
let's do
it. Educational outcomes for women leaps and bounds ahead of those for men, and they only get the difference only increases as you work through the educational system. So it's almost like from day dot, from the get-go, the girls are better readers, better at the sciences, are better at a lot of these things than boys. And obviously there are social issues that sort of impact whether or not girls, say, follow maths or follow science, which we're getting better at dealing with. But it is really funny that it's not really spoken about. Like, for all of the patriarchy whinging that we hear about, and we need more women in tech, we need more women doing sciences, blah blah
leadership
blah,
roles and things like
yeah,
that.
it is really funny that, say, in the areas where they are dominating, like in education, you pretty much go all the way up to high school. There's more girls that graduate. You go to university, there's more girls getting pretty much every single degree, every single type of degree as well nowadays. Like, there may be the odd one or two, right? Like a PhD in conceptual physics or whatever, particle physics or something, and it's like, oh my god, look, 90% are male. But it always blows my mind that
I
we
think
just totally
engineering
ignore.
is still pretty male dominated.
Yeah, and there will be some. There's always going to be those sort of inherent differences between the sexes and what we find interesting. And I think that, women are going to gravitate towards, say, nursing or childcare or teaching social sort of sides of things compared to, say, particle physics or, engineering or whatever. And that's not to say that anyone who wants to do those courses shouldn't be able to do them, but I hate that attitude of looking at, oh, look, there's a difference between the two, therefore patriarchy or therefore sexism. It's like, this is just such a myopic view of, oh my God, these things aren't equal, therefore bang, this is the problem. And it's like, maybe we should probably go in and like tease this apart, cause and correlation.
Yeah,
well, but that did blow my mind how many that, like in biology in particular. I remember being at the museum doing my master's and then my PhD, and the women there would always be ranting and raving about, we need more women in tech, or we need more women in science, we need more women in STEM. And I'd be like, have a fucking look around. I am the only male doing a master's degree. There are 20 students at the museum here studying. They are all female. We are doing biology, guys. We are all doing biology. Have a look at the demographic in biology. Like, they're all female. And then when I did the PhD, it was the same thing. I was the only male. There were like 6 other students. They were all female. And I just remember always having this, what are you talking about? Look around, damn it. Like, there's bloody women everywhere. And then looking at the studies that looked at educational outcomes and being like, women are the ones scoring all the PhDs, all of the master's degrees, all the honors degrees, they're finishing their bachelors. I think the issue is that they don't end up going for the same jobs or ending up in the same job positions. And that's why we may have this feeling of there aren't enough women in STEM, or there aren't enough,
they're not the high paying positions. They're not the, the ones which maybe on the outside appear more glamorous. Oh, there's not enough CEOs who are women, but fuck being
anyone
CEO,
can be a CEO. I'm a CEO.
Yeah.
Have a look at how many CEOs are self-made. Probably the majority of them, I would imagine, right? They just started a company, they had an idea, and they became the CEO of that job. Not every, like, look, Zuckerberg, the guy from Apple until he died, like all of these big companies, generally the CEOs are men because the men are the ones, they just happen to start those companies. So it's not like there are all these CEO jobs going around and they just like don't hire women. Anyone can become a CEO tomorrow. Like, go start a company, be your own boss, come up with ideas. Ideas are free. So I don't know. That's a chip on my shoulder I always have. My sister's always sort of complaining about that. We need more women CEOs. And I'm like, this is such a myopic view. You can become a CEO tomorrow. Go start your own company. Don't wait around to be given something. Take it. Go make it yourself. Like, screw everyone else. Take it on yourself and be your own boss.
Classic patriarchy man speak here from Pete. Unbelievable.
I know, I'm disgusting. Absolutely disgusting.
Definitely. Yeah, well, I the latest
again, I should caveat that's not to say that there aren't issues,
yes,
but I think that broader idea of the patriarchy, it feels to me like a conspiracy theory. Like that there's a cohort of men, cloaks and daggers behind the stage just being like, make sure that you always keep the boot on the neck of women. And you sort of like, I think we're just not looking at this the right way. And I think that picking and choosing of where are there more men doing well and then being like, therefore patriarchy, than say, did you know that 96% of deaths at work are male? Like, does that mean that it's like a matriarchy? You know, like there are definitely shit stats. Rate,
yeah,
exactly. There's plenty of stats that you can pick. Prostate cancer is 100% a male issue.
We die, what is it, 4 years, on average 4 years earlier than women. It's like that's 81 and 85. Yeah,
that's a big one that always blows my mind. I'm like, if it's a patriarchy, why are women living longer? Why are they having better health outcomes? You know, why is the hospital system way better at treating women than men? You know, if everything is literally set up to do better for men, where's my membership, and where are all of the benefits that I am meant to be getting from this fucking membership? Because I feel pretty left out, you know, on my own, to be honest.
Yeah, every time I look into this, I come away with, there is usually some sort of slight bias, like the what is it, the pay gap. You know, it's not 75 to 100. It's maybe 98 to 100.
Yep.
You know, and that 2% can maybe be explained by some inbuilt systems. But every time I look into it, it's just like, maybe
but also
this
behavior,
tiny little thing. But it's all down to personality.
Yeah, which they just don't seem to ever want to talk about,
because
because I don't know why that is such a topic that they want to avoid at all costs. I guess they probably think that if it's biological, it's innate and you can't change it. But from my point of view as a biologist, it's like, no, that means that you can do something about it once you realize, okay, so for instance, if the pay gap, a big chunk of the pay gap is that women aren't as forthcoming and persistent with getting a pay rise as men are because of personality trait differences, you know, on a large scale. There will be some women that are and there will be some men that aren't. But by and large, say, more men push for pay rises than women. You don't just learn that that's sort of like a biological, psychological trait and then be like, well, I guess we do nothing about it. You know, too bad. That's how things are. No, the thing is, okay, so we now recognize that women are less likely to push for a pay rise. So what do? We train women to push for fucking pay rises more frequently because they're now aware that they are biologically or psychologically less likely to do that naturally. And so, like, for my wife at the moment, she's about to take on a full-time job. And I'm like, ask for a raise. Ask for a raise. You've worked in this job now for, I don't know, getting close to a year. They want you to work full-time. Ask for a fucking raise or tell them you're going to leave. And she'll be like, oh, no, I can't do that. So rude. And I'll be like, dude, like, this is the reason there's pay gap differences. like, I'm telling you now, you are asking for a raise. Whether it's 50 cents an hour, I don't care. This is what you're going to do. You know, here's the patriarchy telling my wife what to do. This is what you're going to do. But I'm like, come on, mate. This is like that voice in your head always being like, I don't want to be rude. I don't want to be too loud. I don't want to be annoying to people in the room or whatever. That's the problem that's the cause of these differences, at least in this case, right? The pay gap. I'm like, you need to be pushing. You need to know your worth. You're doing a good job. Fuck these people if they don't want to pay you well. Find another job, right? Like, if they can't afford to treat you with respect and give you a better pay rise because you're doing a good job for them and you're making them money, then, you know, so yeah, I don't know. A big part of it, I think, is just educating people to being aware of those kinds of, not deficits, but you know, like weaknesses and strengths, knowing your weaknesses and strengths, and then being able to kind of counter the weaknesses, right? Implement things that are going to strengthen your weaknesses as a result of understanding your psychology or biology, you know, based on the demographic that you may or may not be a part of. So,
for sure. Sorry
for ranting.
No, it's good. I love ranting. I'm going to get to see like the first-hand view of this in a short while because I hope by the time we release this, I'm pretty sure we'll have done an episode. But Juan's going to have a baby
awesome,
in April.
And it's going to be a daughter, is it?
Yes, it is for sure.
Oh, Jesus!
So we'll see all these things start to emerge over the next year or years, I guess. So yeah, that'll be pretty fascinating.
Yeah, man, I still want you to become a dad, dude. Like if you don't impregnate someone soon, I'm gonna have to impregnate you, I think.
I'm working on it, man. I'm working on it. I know. I've got some strategies in place.
You just show up tomorrow and you're like, "Here's a child. I found it. It's my. This is my son."
Yeah, not particularly the impregnation part, but I got to start with somewhere. Finding the girl.
Yeah, if you need any advice on how that all works, I can definitely help you.
Please. We're doing it wrong the whole time.
Oh, man. I think I'm going to have to bugger off, dude.
Yeah, you got some stuff to
Yeah,
do.
sorry.
Yeah, it's all
I'm
good,
meeting
man.
someone for lunch at 1:00, so forgive me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, too easy. To finish off, though, I want a quick story. So I met this girl recently who she always, like basically on a Friday and Sunday, I do handstand with friends in South Bank. And we always see these Segway tours come around. And there's always this girl who's kind of like leading it, which I've nicknamed Seguina. And so I saw
Turns
Seguina.
out that's her actual name.
That would have been awesome. I actually went up and chatted with her one time, and she came along. She actually turned out to do handstands, so we kind of made friends. And she was saying, like when I first met you, you actually look like this podcaster. And I was
God.
no fucking way. And yeah, sure enough, she was like, yeah. I was like, oh, you talking about Aussie English? She's like,
you should have been like, mere mortals, bitch. That's me. Guess again. Yeah. You're about to be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. So it was obviously your podcast is getting out there, man. Still, because she tuned into it for a fair while, and she was from the Netherlands and was tuning in, trying to get some Aussie English. And her English was pretty good, so I'm gonna attribute a portion of that to you, man. So congrats on that. And then obviously I need to start wearing like more hats or stuff around when I'm just get this association far enough away. But
all these poor Australians that are like bald with beards are going to start being likened to me.
Yeah, exactly, man. Exactly. If someone's out there and they want to know what you're up to, man, it sounds like you're doing a lot more stuff with the plant channel, Pete vs Plants as well. So
yeah, exactly.
I was tuning into that.
The name. I haven't mentioned that on the Aussie English channel because I wanted to see what I could do with YouTube.
Yeah, you kept separating it, right? Yeah,
I didn't want to fuck it up because if you suddenly have an influx of people who aren't inherently interested in the topic and they're just clicking on and clicking off, it sends the wrong messages to YouTube.
For sure.
But I've had several people find me who know Aussie English. They're like, oh shit, it's the Aussie English dude doing plants. He's a plant dad. He's a plant guy. And I'm like, wait, what? And it'll be some person from like, Texas or something. And they'll be like, yeah, I know of Aussie English. And I'll be like, what?
Yeah.
And I like plants.
That overlap. Yeah, well, I mean, that's it. The overlap of interests it can go pretty far. You'd think people learning English from as a kind of second language usually, which is, I imagine, the predominant. And then people who are obsessed with houseplants. And if you can't see, Pete's got, I'm guessing, like 15 different plants behind him there.
I've got a few. This is the room with barely any in it.
Is your kitchen still?
I like to hide my shame off camera. Yeah, it is. I've got about 250 plants in my kitchen.
Dang, yeah, that's wild, man. That's wild. Well,
anyway, just like, what the fuck? Just do handstands, bro.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when you had that story on the recent one of like coming across, it was like $270 in Bunnings, and you bought it on a couple of seconds of thought. That's where I was like, oh, maybe you need some intervention.
Oh, it's gotten worse than that, dude. It's gotten a lot worse than that.
I bet. Well, thanks for coming on, man. We'll do a longer one sometime in the future. I want to do more of these, so yeah, we can make this a more common thing.
It's fun. I love being able to just chat about whatever sort of comes up and see where it goes and solve the world's problems. So thanks for having me, mate. I'll have to have you back on the podcast again. I think it'll be for like episode 4 now. I'm not sure. You've been on quite a few times.
Yeah, I think this is 4 or 5 for you as well. I've lost track as well. People, awesome. Where do you want to direct people if they wanted to know more? Well,
if you're into plants, you can check out Pete versus Plants on YouTube. If you're not, don't. And if you're into English, go check out Aussie English. And if you're not, don't.
Perfect. Awesome, man. We'll leave it there. Until the next time.
Yeah, thanks, mate. See you guys.